Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. We continue our operation. My name is Olga Atamanova. It's day 301 of the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people. On Monday, the Russia's troops inflicted another massive drone strike in Ukraine. Unfortunately, again, they targeted our power infrastructure, our energy grid, and we will be talking about its condition right now. Joining us in this studio is Oleksandr Kharchenko, director at the Energy Industry Research Institute. Good afternoon. So can you give us a few comments on the current condition of our power grid? What are the consequences of the last strike? How is the rebuilding going now? Let's discuss a couple of aspects. First of all is the general national aspect. We have a deficit in generation so far. We're talking about 25-30% of the lack of the generating capacity due to the damage of the power plants. But taking the situation in the nationwide scale is different from situation in Kiev, because the last attack was focused specifically in Kiev and Kiev region. There was some substantial damage which resulted in the fact that Kiev, which is already quite the problematic region in terms of power supply, it became even more difficult to transport the electric power to Kiev region and distribute it across the region. So the reconstruction is in progress currently, but in view of the nature of the equipment having been damaged, I would say that the Kievites should be ready that within the next 2 to 3 weeks, the availability of power in their homes within 4 to 6 years per day are good news. So I cannot disclose all the facts regarding what we expect in terms of the equipment being supplied or on the way to us, but it will be quite difficult to achieve better situation within less than 2 to 3 weeks. There was information that the deficit of the generating capacity in Kiev and Kiev region is about 50%. Well, the question is how to deliver the electric power to Kiev, because the redistributing substations were damaged to a large extent. So the existing deficit in Kiev region, without, say, critical infrastructure, it would be 60-65%, in fact. So if we feed the critical infrastructure, more than half of the consumers would be disconnected at some certain moment from the power grid. And in real life, there are many districts where people don't have power more than 24 hours. And we have to understand that those emergencies caused by drones and rockets and missiles is one aspect, and another aspect is a number of minor emergencies which show up due to destabilization of the power grid. And the substations, some local substations responsible for the power supply to, say, 10-12 buildings, they start operating in improper way, and some people start complaining that everything, the lights are on around us, but there is no power at our apartment block. And that's exactly the situation which is caused by those emergencies and the substations. And for example, in a case, if a repair team is working on some certain object, they have to disconnect some other building, and they usually give preference to the districts where they can provide electric power supply to the most of the consumers. And there are some specific situations where people unfortunately suffer a lot, and unfortunately this is the reality we're having now. I hope that today or tomorrow such situation in Kiev and in Kiev region will be done with within the next few days, that the repair team will come there and they will repair everything. But I have a request to all the Ukrainians: don't try to do it yourself, because a lot of people who think they have some basic knowledge in electric engineering and they try to fix something or switch something, it may result in some tragic consequences on one hand, and the negative influence on the power grid on another hand, because such people in fact break the equipment which is supposed to supply electric power to their dwellings. So my request is don't touch anything in this regard, because it will harm you. Mr. Oleksandr, it's probably the first time that people end up without power supply within more than 2 weeks. In some cases a little bit less. Somebody still is without power supply. But what about the other regions? Which regions suffered the most? Well, the most complicated situation now is in Kiev and the regions along the front lines. So Kiev can be equalized with those regions along the front lines which were recently liberated, or those which can be still reached by the enemy MLRS or cannon artillery so far. I mean, Kherson region and Kharkiv region, for example. In Kherson, the situation is catastrophically difficult, and the Muscovites, they keep hitting the power infrastructure targetedly, purposefully, but this is a situation that we're having now, we have to fight with. What the situation is with the nuclear power plants at this moment? Two power plants operate in a normal way, and some blocks are currently working. Two blocks are currently working, and for what I know, Energoatom started some preventive operations there, but because it's impossible to give all the power to the grid, and as soon as the grid will be rebuilt, they will be ready to supply the power into the grid. If there are any questions, dear colleagues, please go ahead. Tomorrow, Rafael Grossi will have a consultation in Moscow as to the creation of the zone of the nuclear safety and security in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And what's your forecast as to the results of this meeting, and what's the situation at the nuclear power plant at this moment? I would like this meeting to have some positive results, but I hope that I have more hope that it's Ukrainian armed forces who can establish some security and safety zone there, rather than such results may be reached by some negotiations, because currently the situation is complicated. There are MLRS systems located currently at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and the occupiers exercise some strict pressure on the personnel of the nuclear power plant. They're trying to pull the stuff into the situation where people would think that it's dangerous for them to stay in Ukraine, and they try to pull us into the ranks of Rosatom. So the situation is quite complicated. So in continuation of your comment, we see that Russia's built some protective structures in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Can you give us a few comments on that? Well, to be honest, there are a lot of news that they're trying to build something, or they try to bring some heaters there. I don't know for what reason. There are some chaotic actions going on. They don't look like some strategy, and it's difficult to see any logic behind that. I don't know what's their purpose, and I think that the local population just shows some initiative, trying to get their hands busy with something. It doesn't look like some purposeful strategy for some actions. Dear friends, are there any more questions in the studio? Well, let's talk about the forecasts. We understand that based on what you've just said, a few more weeks are necessary for reconstruction, and after that, are we gonna be able to return to the scheduled power shutdowns? Well, maybe within 1 week or 2 to 3 weeks, the longest, we will be back to the scheduled power shutdowns, including in Kiev, but we have to understand that such shutdowns would not be comfortable. The situation is such that the schedule will be maybe 10 hours per day at its best, in the best case, and 14 hours per day people will stay without power. But on the other hand, there is a large amount of equipment coming our way, and we have to understand when the high voltage equipment will be coming, and the very efficient work is in progress, which will allow to bring to Kiev gas turbine equipment, which will provide proper generation for Kiev and cover the needs for Kiev and the region. And it's gonna be, first of all, feed the whole grid in any situation, both in terms of critical infrastructure and water supply and heat supply, and it will facilitate the transportation of the electric power to all the suppliers. So I hope that mobile generation capacities will show up very soon, and the work is very intense in this regard. We see a lot of information in open sources that the goal of the Russians is to leave us without electric power for New Year and Christmas. When do we expect another missile or drone attack to happen? Well, the lessons that we learned just make us stronger. The dispatchers and engineers of Ukrinform, they've already understood in what way should they act, so we don't end up in a situation similar to the 23rd of November when we really had a blackout. So I think they would be able to prevent the uncontrolled shutdowns. Maybe a part of Ukrainians will be forced to meet the new year in difficult conditions, maybe extremely difficult conditions. So I just want to call those who have their private houses with generators, invite your friends, and friends from Kiev, look for friends with private houses and generators. You will need this, and you will feel more happy in that way. Thank you, sir. I suggest we wrap up on this positive note. I'm reminding you, joining us was Oleksandr Kharchenko, Director of the Energy Industry Research Institute. Dear colleagues, right now our team is preparing the schedule of events for tomorrow, so follow our announcements, work for our victory, and trust in our armed forces. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.